We'll start. Welcome to the Jackson Hole China Forum. I know this week is the week before last week, so students are busy at their papers. So for those who are not here, they miss a lot. You will miss a lot. And we are extremely delighted that we have a speaker coming. We have a speaker, Bonnie Glaser, coming from Washington, D.C. And Bonnie is a well-known name in the field of China and East Asia studies, mostly in the policy world. She has published so many policy pieces. Almost every day I read her pieces. I don't know how she can write all those pieces once at least one day. In fact, I heard from my friend she's one of the working hardest person in the field of China studies. When I was in Beijing, a friend from Kicker always told me how difficult they have helped her to get schedules done because she can meet 12 people a day and talking to all those people about those issues she's interested. So that's why she can publish so many pieces every day or every month. Today, Bonnie Glaser will talk about the escalation between China and Japan in the East China Sea. This issue has been going on for quite a while. Both China and Japan have showed their strong positions and make strong actions on this issue. People even talk there is a possibility of accident happening. Then these two second large economy and third large economy of the world will come to war. We hope that will not happen, but that's the concern of people on this issue. That's why this issue is so important today. So we are so happy that Bonnie Glaser is coming to talk about this issue. So please join me to welcome Bonnie Glaser. And also we are so proud today. Also we have our Dean, Ambassador Hill, agreed to serve as commentator to start the discussion after her presentation. So welcome Dean Hill, Ambassador Hill.
Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you for coming. The slides are just some maps and photos to look at in case you get bored. So, I'm going to talk today about the dispute in the East China Sea. I'm not going to focus on the historical basis of the territorial dispute, so I hope that doesn't disappoint. But one could easily get into the weeds on that and probably not come out with any useful conclusion. So I'm really going to focus on the crisis that began in September last year, and I'm going to discuss the dynamics and the drivers of the confrontation and the role of the United States, the risks that are posed by the ongoing operations, the standoff in the East China Sea. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about potential crisis management tools that could be used to avoid an even bigger crisis. So let me start with a bit about the background.
Excuse me, could you speak more to the mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. For those of you who've never been to the region, there's at least some of the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Intrinsically probably don't have much value themselves. And for many decades, Tokyo and Beijing have abided by a tacit agreement to basically keep this dispute pretty much under control. Japan did not carry out any new construction or let people land on the islands deliberately, although occasionally there have been some incidents. We've had activists from Japan and from Hong Kong that have tried to land on the islands. And China didn't push its claims very assertively to the islands, and it really didn't let the dispute interfere with the trade and political relationships. And there have been occasional flare-ups, but those have been diffused. So this recent crisis really began in April of last year, when Tokyo Governor Ishihara, who is a hardline nationalist in Japan, declared his intention to use the Tokyo metropolitan government funds to purchase 3 of these 5 islands. And they were owned by a private landowner. And in fact, Japanese donors were so supportive of this in Japan that they contributed about $16 million to a fund to purchase the islands. So about 3 months later, then Japanese Prime Minister Noda announced that instead of allowing Governor Ishihara to purchase these islands, that the Japanese central government would purchase them and nationalize these 3 islands. And the objective of the Japanese government was to continue maintaining these islands in a stable and a peaceful manner. So the decision was made based on this judgment that nationalization was really the only means to maintain control over possible construction and landings on the island. And that would enable Tokyo to sustain what I refer to as this tacit agreement that has existed on how to manage this issue. So in my view, and that is just my subjective view, this was not part of a Japanese strategy to challenge China, nor was it really intended to change the status quo, which is what Beijing later charged. So subsequently, there was a very brief, about 15-minute meeting on the margins of the APEC summit meeting in Vladivostok between Prime Minister Noda and Chinese President Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao delivered, although it's a very brief meeting, delivered a very tough message. He said that the situation was quite severe in the East China Sea, and he asserted that it was illegal and invalid for Japan to buy these islands via any means. And he said China would unswervingly safeguard its sovereignty, and urged Prime Minister Noda to not make the wrong decision. The very next day, Japan announced that it would nationalize the islands. And that was very much viewed by people in China as a real loss of face for their president. So you can see in this sort of where the islands exist relative to the countries that claim them. Taiwan, of the Republic of China, is the 3rd claimant over these islands. They're the original claim, and then of course China and Japan, so you can see where they're located. So I should mention that tensions in the Sino-Japanese relationship really hadn't fully abated from what was a prior incident that took place in September 2010, which was when a Chinese fishing captain who was drunk had rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel and ended up he was detained for more than 2 weeks in Japan before being released. And what's interesting about this event was, I think that the Chinese concluded that their use of economic pressure against Japan, where they did seek to curtail the export of rare earth minerals to Japan, and their use of also political pressure against Japan, that worked. That was a victory. In Japan, the Japanese government was criticized basically for caving into China because they ended up releasing the captain. And in the wake of that incident, Japan really began to increase its patrols of law enforcement vessels around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Now, at that time, they usually operated in the contiguous waters. There were only 2 times in that period that they entered into the 12-mile territorial water zone. So when the islands were nationalized, China strongly condemned this act. Beijing claimed that Japan's move to purchase some of these islands went against a bilateral understanding between China and Japan that they claim was reached in 1971 to shelve the issue. And Chinese officials told the U.S. and other countries that Noda and Ishihara were working together hand in glove, that this was a strategy that Japan was using to alter the status quo, and potentially to pursue a strategy where Japan would then construct buildings on the islands and push the issue even further. Now, based on my understanding, that was patently untrue. I heard that Noda and Ishihara had quite a intense confrontation over the issue. But as I said earlier, there was this issue of loss of face for China because the nationalization took place one day after the meeting between the Prime Minister and Hu Jintao. So my own view was, really is, that Tokyo was correct to avoid an outcome in which Ishihara became the owner of these islands. I think that would have created a far less predictable situation. I think the intention of the Japanese government was actually a good, positive intention. But I think that Japan maybe didn't consider all of the possibilities before they made that choice. The timing was very, very poor. And the matter really wasn't well handled. And so I think that it was probably predictable that this would end up in a major crisis. I would note that there were some officials in the Chinese government that favored a different approach. I heard that the Asia Department in the Chinese Foreign Ministry wrote a report that actually advocated accepting the explanation of the Noda government that the islands would be better nationalized than given to Ishihara, because at least that part of the foreign ministry believed that this was in fact a better outcome. Now, whether this report only went up to the foreign minister or whether it went higher, I don't know, but clearly it was rejected. But there were some people in China who at least were persuaded by Japan's case. It's my view that Beijing viewed this nationalization of the islands as both a challenge and an opportunity. So it was definitely seen as a challenge to Chinese sovereignty claims that really had to be dealt with harshly to prevent criticism of the leadership. And this took place, importantly, on the eve of the 18th Party Congress and the transition of Chinese leadership. And I think that they were very sensitive to the issue of not being seen as weak. So it's certainly seen as a challenge. At the same time, I'm going to argue that it's also seen as an opportunity. An opportunity first to stoke nationalism in advance of the 18th Party Congress, to forge unity in support of this change of leadership, and to assert Chinese jurisdiction in the disputed waters, with the conscious effort of seeking to contest Japanese administrative control over the islands and the adjacent waters. So now I'm going to turn to the dynamics behind the confrontation. And I'm going to point out several factors. And I'm not going to really argue which one is the most important, because I think that there are a confluence of factors that shaped how this crisis evolved. The first one, which is really in the background, is the shift in the Asian and global balances of power. It is clear that the balance of power between Japan and China is shifting in China's favor. It has already shifted from an aggregate economic sense, and I would say to a large part has shifted in China's favor politically. Now, militarily, the Japanese retain an advantage, and of course Japan is also backed by the United States. The other aspect of the balance of power that is important is this global balance, and that is the narrowing in the gap of power between China and the United States. And we can argue how real that is or to what extent it's narrowing, but certainly in the view of the Chinese, this is a gap that is becoming narrower, and China sees itself as rising. They see that a power transition is very much underway. And I think they see the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, as the Chinese, I believe, are still quite conscious of the century of humiliation that China suffered. and not necessarily looking for revenge, but seeking to protect their interests, as they believe that their interests were in fact trampled on for so many years when China was weak and they were unable to defend themselves. So there's the sense that China's getting stronger now and can stand up for its interests. The second factor is popular nationalism, and that exists in both countries. In China, anti-Japanese protests erupted throughout the country. I was in China when some of these protests were taking place, though I was in Dalian at the time, and there were no protests there. People said that was because Bo Xilai had served there, and he had created a good party structure, and it still was there, even though Bo Xilai had been put under arrest. But for whatever reasons, there were no protests in Dalian, but there were certainly in cities all over China. They were encouraged by the government, although I believe that some of the vandalism that resulted was not the intention of the Chinese government. These things can get out of control. And then, nationalism, of course, was also a factor influencing Japan's foreign policy. Public opinion polls show the Japanese public is very hostile toward China. And under the Noda administration, there was a willingness to work with China in a way that some people perceived as weakness. I referred earlier to the example of releasing the Chinese fishing captain. There was also an instance where the Japanese canceled a planned exercise. It was a part of an exercise between the United States and Japan to defend an outlying island. And that was also perceived, I think, by some in Japan as weakness. And so when the new LDP government has come to power under Prime Minister Abe, there is now a determination to be very firm and uncompromising on this issue. My sense is that Japan believes it must show resolve or it will invite further intimidation. Another factor that is at play here, which I think is less urgent, but is probably in the minds of leaders, is the resource issue. The waters around the island are very rich in fish, although the Japanese fishermen traditionally don't really fish in those waters. It's mostly Taiwanese and Chinese fishing. There are estimates of reserves of hydrocarbons and gas, but the area is really underexplored, so we really don't know. I'll cite, just to give you one estimate, the U.S.-based Energy Information Administration estimates that the East China Sea has between 60 and 100 million barrels of oil and between 1 and 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, Chinese estimates are much higher. But whichever country gets these islands, if one gets real sovereignty over them, then their claims to untapped reserves would certainly be bolstered. The next factor is growing Chinese civilian ship capabilities, vessels, white-hulled ships, which are really paramilitary vessels that the Chinese have been building in very large numbers to patrol not only these waters, but also the South China Sea. In the past 5 years, the Chinese have built a very large number of these white-hulled vessels. By 2015, China will acquire 36 new marine maritime surveillance ships in the 600, 1,000, 1,500 ton category. There was a captain from the Pacific Command who is in charge of intelligence, who has been widely quoted. He gave a presentation at a conference, and his presentation is up on the internet, so it's gotten some attention. He referred to this China maritime surveillance as a full-time maritime sovereignty harassment organization. They may have a bit of truth, but the Chinese have other parts of their system that engage in things like protecting fishermen, engaging in search and rescue, the kind of Coast Guard missions that you would see the United States engaged in. So it really does appear that at least one of the core missions of the China Maritime Surveillance Organization is to assert Chinese sovereignty. And so this connects to what I want to point to is the next dynamic, which is what occurred in Scarborough Shoal in, between the April to June period of 2012. And this is in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. And so there was a standoff that had started in April. The Philippines had brought in a cutter that they bought from the United States, basically was refurbished to be a warship. And the Chinese reacted very harshly because they saw that it's very provocative. The cutter was brought in to arrest Chinese fishermen who were poaching. But the key here is that the Chinese brought in these large maritime surveillance ships and established a presence and put up a rope so that they blocked off access to the lagoon. There was actually quite tense standoff because the Philippines couldn't get in food and water to bring to the sailors who were manning the boat. And the Chinese and Philippines, with some U.S. facilitation, I understand, reached an agreement whereby both of these countries would pull their vessels out of the shoal. And they would do it in a face-saving way where they wouldn't admit that either had done anything wrong. So, make a long story short, the Philippines pulled out and the Chinese didn't. I think that the Chinese drew some important lessons from that experience. They saw this as a successful application of these new civilian ships to assert their sovereignty. Now, in the East China Sea, this is unlikely to be successful in the near term. Let's face it, Japan is not the Philippines. But establishing a record of effective governance, again, can bolster China's case in the future, especially if this case ever goes to court, that the Chinese would say, we now have effective administrative control, at least as much as Japan does, and we should be able to assert our sovereignty just as convincingly in our governance as Japan. So I have two more factors that I want to point to. The next one is a strategic factor. I personally think that this is very important in the minds of the Chinese military. There are a lot of PLA writings that talk about how the Chinese Navy could get bottled up in wartime and how the Chinese need to break out of the first island chain. The Chinese Navy has been exercising going beyond the first island chain through the Straits of Osumi and Miyako. And this is very crucial to the breakout strategy. So Japanese control of the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands is potentially risky for China because it prevents China from breaking out of that first island chain in a crisis. And if the Japanese were to construct things on the islands, they could put in a radar system that could track Chinese submarines, for example. So I think that the Chinese here saw an opportunity that if they controlled the islands, they would provide a foothold for them to have greater confidence that they could break out of the first island chain. And then the last dynamic that I think is underway here is that China seeks to demonstrate to Japan and other U.S. allies in the region that the U.S. really is not going, in all circumstances, in all scenarios, to come to the aid of its allies. This is a tough test of the U.S.-Japan alliance and of the United States. We have, our diplomats can issue tough rhetoric, and that's important. But at the other end of that spectrum, we have the 7th Fleet. I don't think we have a whole lot in our diplomatic toolbox in between. And I think China sees this weakness. And China is sowing doubts among many of the countries in the region about the advisability of relying on the United States for their security. So this is just a political cartoon to entertain. And I'm going to turn to the issue of the U.S. policy and the U.S. role. So first, to state the obvious, a war between China and Japan is not in the U.S. interest. I think that goes without saying. There are some people in China who think that the United States benefits from a degree of tensions between China and Japan. And I don't hold that view. I think that the United States always gets nervous when tensions between Tokyo and Beijing spike. And in this case, we are particularly concerned. But from a broader perspective, maintaining peaceful and cooperative ties between these two countries is essential for regional security, and it's essential for global economic growth. This is a very important piece of the global supply chain, and if disrupted, would be very damaging to the region and, of course, to the global economy. Beyond that, of course, the United States has both an interest and a potential obligation to defend Japan's security, and we really don't want to go to war over these rocks or islets. It's really difficult to call them islands, but maybe one of them is big enough to call an island. So at the inception of this crisis, U.S. government officials were really quite clear. They enunciated U.S. policy. First, that we take no position on sovereignty. The U.S. has always been neutral on the issue of sovereignty of the islands, and U.S. officials urged China and Japan to lower tensions and resolve their disputes through dialogue. And at the same time, they clearly repeated that Japan has effective administrative control over these islands, and that the islands fall under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And therefore, if there is a reason that we have to come to Japan's defense, the implication is that we would do so. It was necessary to make those statements, I think, to both dissuade and deter China as well as reassure Japan. Now, this U.S. position, of course, this will be my only statement about history, is based on the fact that after World War II, the U.S. Took control of Okinawa, and this included the Senkaku Islands, and the Senkaku or Diaoyu were included as one of the U.S. administered territories that were, of course, returned to Japan when Okinawa reverted to Japan in 1972. So U.S. officials are concerned about the potential for miscalculation or accidents in the East China Sea. You see here just a photo of Hong Kong and Taiwanese activists that landed on the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. This took place in September. I have a photo later on of another incident with Taiwan, and actually Taiwan has not been a very helpful actor in this particular crisis, but having people actually land on these islands is potentially very, very provocative, because it could provoke one side or the other to respond very, very strongly. So a couple of other things that have happened in the last few months that have worried U.S. officials. This is a picture of a Y-12, which is a Chinese maritime surveillance aircraft, and it flew near the islands, not directly over them, but it was the first time that the Chinese flew such an aircraft in Japanese airspace. So this took place in mid-December. And I think this was viewed by many U.S. officials as a deliberate and dangerous escalation. I recently had the opportunity to talk to a PLA official who told me that the Central Maritime Surveillance aircraft and ships, the organization, is under the State Council. He insisted that the PLA was not consulted when this plane was dispatched, but the PLA was notified. So they basically had to cope with the potential consequences of sending the plane up there. But this is not a military craft. And I believe that. There is a serious problem in China with too many actors involved in trying to defend a variety of Chinese interests. So, why this plane went in there, I assume that at the higher levels of the Chinese government that there was somebody who knew that this was happening. But I believe that the PLA may not have had a role in that decision. But what happened here was that the Chinese scrambled F-15s, in fact, 8 F-15s in response. The Japanese, I'm sorry. The Japanese don't have they don't have civilian aircraft like this. So their rules of engagement, somebody enters their airspace, it's a violation, they just scrambled their F-15s. And so then the Chinese in turn scrambled their fighters. And that created a very, very dangerous moment. It's bad enough when you have ships operating in close proximity, but it's even worse when you have aircraft. So this was seen as particularly dangerous. There was also a delegation that was sent in December by our Secretary of State, then Hillary Clinton, this was a Track 2 effort by 4 former U.S. officials, and they were Joseph Nye, Steve Hadley, Rich Armitage, and Jim Steinberg. And when I talked to Rich Armitage about this, he said he was absolutely stunned that they were sent out with absolutely no message, no instruction whatsoever. And here you have people who, if given their opportunity, might say very different things, I think, about the issue, although they could all agree on the fact that the message needed to be to calm everybody down. But Richard Armitage told the press during the trip that although the U.S. is, again, neutral on the sovereignty issue, that the U.S. is not neutral when our ally is a victim of aggression or intimidation. He added that the language of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty makes it impossible for the U.S. To remain neutral. And that was a pretty tough, I think, message to the Chinese. Yang Jiechi apparently opened up the meeting by thanking the 4 of them for U.S. neutrality. And Rich Armitage's response was basically what I just quoted. So the final U.S. position that was put out was on January 18th, just a few weeks before Secretary Clinton left office. And this is the most recent U.S. position, and it did move the ball forward a little bit. She said that the U.S. opposes any unilateral actions that would seek to undermine Japanese administration of the islands. I believe this was said because it reflected the concern of the administration that the Chinese are, in fact, seeking to challenge Japan's administrative control, as I said earlier. And the message officials, I think, felt needed to be given that even if the Chinese attempt to do that this is not something that the U.S. is going to recognize. So again, this is just sort of a description of what role the U.S. has played and what officials have said. So why is the situation dangerous? And here's just one photo of Japanese Coast Guard ship and a Chinese maritime surveillance ship. It's a little difficult, of course, to tell from a photo, but these ships are operating pretty closely. Under the Noda administration, the naval ships were operating very, very far in the distance. The Japanese ROEs, the rules of engagement that their Navy was told, was to stay out of the visual line of sight of the PLA, and there was quite a distance. When Abe came to power, this was changed. They went back to apparently what were former ROEs, and now they're operating very, very close, within line of sight. And you may have read that a couple of weeks ago there was an incident where the Japanese claimed that the Chinese ship turned on a fire control radar and aimed it at a Japanese ship. Happened to be in Singapore about 2 weeks ago, talked to the PLA officer who was in charge of this investigation, and he swears up and down that this did not happen. And you know, he might be right. He said that his initial thought was that it might have been possible that somebody turned on the radar by accident, but he said after the investigation, he was certain this did not take place. He also added that there was no way that the Japanese could prove it in any case. So maybe that was a factor. So prior to the nationalization of the islands by Japan, the Chinese sailed in the 12 nautical mile territorial waters of those islands only 4 times. Since the crisis, they've now sailed 32 times. So this is now a constant effort to patrol in those waters. This is just another photo of this is a PC-3 surveillance plane flying over a maritime surveillance ship. Again, there's a safe operating distance where you should fly over a ship. Of course, again, you can't tell from a photo. I don't know whether that looks like it's unsafe. But I think the very fact that these aircraft and ships are operating in close proximity creates enough reason to be concerned. The Chinese have now publicly complained about close-range Japanese surveillance and monitoring of China's Navy, as well as its maritime surveillance ships. This is a photo of, this shows you how everybody gets into the action. In December, Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan, sent in some It was actually a fishing boat, but he sent 4 Coast Guard ships to defend the fishing boat. And this was all like what we call kabuki. It was all orchestrated. Taiwan told the Japanese government in advance where they were going to go, and the Japanese brought out the Coast Guard ship, and so they sprayed water at each other. But this really creates a real potential for accident when you have ships operating in close proximity. There were mainland vessels that were very close by as well. So turning to the last section on what can be done to mitigate tensions. I think it's clear that the sovereignty dispute cannot be resolved in the near term. What does Japan want? Japan wants to return to the status quo ante. And I think it's quite clear China is not going to agree to that. What does China want? Well, first and foremost, I think China wants Japan to admit that there is a territorial dispute. The Japanese admit that there's a territorial dispute with South Korea, with Russia, but in this case, they've never admitted that there is this dispute. They don't accept that there was an agreement in '71 to shelve the dispute. So China wants to return to this position that there is a dispute and it was shelved. Secondly, I think that what the Chinese may want is possibly joint administration over the islands. And I have read this in some Chinese articles. I've talked to some Chinese. I think they believe that ultimately this is something they have already achieved, and now they don't want to give it up. They would, of course, like Japan to recognize that, but that's not going to happen. So neither China nor Japan is likely to concede when tensions are high. So none of these sovereignty issues or creating a new stable status quo, I think, is even too difficult at this juncture. But it's really urgent for China and Japan to take steps to reduce tensions and minimize the risk of accidents. In fact, there was a series of discussions that was taking place in 2011 where the two sides talked about setting up crisis management mechanisms, including the creation of a hotline. These, of course, have now been all put on hold, and these discussions, I think, should be resumed. And in addition to that, let me just put forward a couple of things that I think would make sense. The most important thing is self-restraint. And this is the message I think the U.S. government is giving to both Japan and China. Both of these countries could take an action that then could force a reaction and a cycle that could create a dangerous accident. So both countries need to make their rules of engagement transparent so that any movement of military forces is predictable. Secondly, intercepts in the air and at sea really have to be conducted according to international standards and norms. These do exist. Both know what they are. Things like maintaining a safe distance, whether it's an aircraft or ships from each other. Certainly there should be no resort to use of military ships and planes unless there is an imminent threat to security. Best to leave the Coast Guards and these white-hulled ships that the Chinese use to deal with any incidents. The number of patrols really should be reduced, and instead they're being increased. And this is really a problem. Japan now has a plan to increase the number of ships that it has. Basically, in order to have one ship on duty, you have to have 4, because you have one in maintenance, you have one getting ready to go out, and then you have one that's behind that. So you only can operate one ship for really every 4 that you have. They're going to expand out to 12. They don't have enough ships now, and in fact, they may be retiring some Navy ships early in order to increase the Coast Guard ships that they have. And then that creates problems because the Chinese will see them as covertly sort of operating military ships rather than Coast Guard. Certainly they should prevent the landing of activists and refrain from construction on the islands. That goes without saying. And there should be no flights of aircraft around the islands. That is just too dangerous. Another thing that I would recommend is the negotiation of an incidents at sea agreement. The original incident at sea agreement was negotiated between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1972. There's been many since then. And this agreement, or these agreements as they are applied by different countries, they reduce the possibility of conflict, they increase knowledge about each other and each other's military forces. They set out what the proximity is that ships can operate in according to these sort of commonly accepted standards. And even more importantly, an INCSE agreement establishes a process of review where naval officers will get together once a year. They'll talk about compliance, and they'll talk about violations, and they'll present complaints to each other. And it's a dialogue and a process where navies get to know each other. So Russia has an INCSE with Japan, with South Korea. There's one between Indonesia and Malaysia. There's a long list of these. Finally, in the longer run, once tensions have eased, I think that China should consider submitting this case to the International Court of Justice. This is probably a stretch. China hasn't reacted too positively to the Philippines' submission of its case that it just submitted a month or so ago to the UN tribunal. But I believe that if Beijing is so confident that its claims are that sound, that it should appeal to an international court to decide the dispute. Since the Japanese have administrative control, the onus is really not on them to take it to the court, it's really on China. And then finally, there really needs to be high-level diplomacy. You can't do this prematurely. You have to have something to declare, something to agree on. Prime Minister Abe has proposed a summit. But if leaders of both countries are ready to declare that a positive Sino-Japanese relationship is important to both countries, if they're prepared to announce measures to ease friction, then I do think that a summit should be convened. So I would just put those things on the table, and I welcome your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Okay, now, those are very interesting recommendations. Hopefully the governments on both sides will hear that. We have a former government official here, a very senior government official. In the past, he was speaking always on behalf of the administration and the government. Now he's from distance, talking as an academic, making comments on Bonnie's presentations. Now, Ambassador Hill.
Thank you very much, and I think everyone here would join me in the view that this was really an excellent presentation that I think covered many of the issues, many of the drivers, many of the dynamics as Bonnie laid out. Even though the discussion focused on Senkaku, I'll just use the Japanese version at the risk of offending people, but even though the discussion focused on Senkaku, I think Bonnie also alluded to the fact that there are island disputes, or territorial disputes with the Philippines, with Malaysia, Indonesia, the whole 9-dash line that essentially turns the South China Sea into a southern Chinese lake. The problems of course, in Senkaku, then you could say, well, this is all about China, but then when you go up a little further north, you see that the ROK and the Japanese have a little dispute going on that has absolutely nothing to do with China. In fact, it's one area where the North Koreans have actually agreed with the South Koreans on the issue of ductile. Bonnie, I think you really very well laid out some of the drivers of this, but the one I would really like to focus on a little more is this issue of nationalism. And when I say nationalism, you know, we see it not just in China, not just in Japan. And frankly, we see it everywhere. Now, is there something in the air, or more likely something in the water? It's hard to say, but there's a lot to be concerned about, and I think there will be more to be concerned about as I think the Japanese, to some extent, regain a little self-confidence, and that seems to be the case under Abe. He seems the second time around, he seems, how to put it, new and improved from the first time around. He seems, I think, quite rightly focusing on the economy. but he's certainly not losing track of these issues as these enhanced ROEs would suggest. I don't believe that these countries will go to war over these islands. I don't think for China these are sort of casus belli type issues, but nonetheless it is very clear that miscalculation in the context of heightened nationalism can really make people do things they will regret in the morning. So there is certainly, I think, reason to be concerned about finding ways to kind of calm this down. I think one of the issues, and you know, I agree with all your sort of your list of sort of remediation strategies, incidents at sea, I think is necessary, but it also speaks to a real dearth of multilateral structures in the region. Now we in the six-party talks, for example, we tried to create something called the Northeast Asia Peace and Security Mechanism. One of the best parts of that was to hear all 5 countries say nice things about it, and then when it got around to the North Koreans, they denounced first the Japanese, and they denounced the United States, and then they denounced the Russians, and then they denounced the South Koreans and the Chinese. So the North Koreans didn't quite get with the program, but I think everyone else understood that there needs to be some better sense of community. One gets the sense that anytime you have one of these island disputes, there's really no place to park the dispute. Now, you know, Europe has these kinds of disputes all over the Mediterranean. I mean, there were some islands that were so low to the sea level that we actually looked into the idea of bombing them to make them disappear. This was an island down near Bay of Kotor in Montenegro. A few B-52 wrecks, I think the island would have disappeared, at least on high tide. I think these things go into such, immediately go into sort of this bilateral axis, and I think that engages this kind of nationalism, and that I think is what has made it very dangerous. One does worry, frankly speaking. I mean, I think the U.S. has taken the right position on our interpretation of Article 5. I mean, we can't be telling the Japanese, no, that doesn't apply to islands, since Japanese are very sensitive about islands. That said, I don't think we want to see ourselves put in a position where the Japanese start telling us when we have to be engaged, and it becomes, if you love us, you'll go to war alongside with us. If you don't love us, you won't go to war. And so that's not a sort of basis for a good alliance. So I think we do need to look at multilateral structures, maybe even more than just an incident at sea, although I think that would be probably a good way to start. I must say, as your analysis suggests, I think the U.S. has kind of handled it pretty well. I think the handling the Philippine China issue, I think was well done. I think less well done has been some of the messaging to the U.S. media, the notion that our pivot to Asia, which by the way now seems to be getting unpivoted by the day, but at least as of last week, our pivot to Asia was somehow an effort to encircle China. I'm not sure is where we really wanted to be 40 years after the Shanghai Accord. In fact, I think it was a very, to talk about pivoting to Asia, whereas our president described in the Honolulu APEC meeting where our long-term interests reside, and then to turn it into kind of still another area of the world where we want to get in confrontation. I mean, we all know, we all have reasons to be very concerned about some of the behavior in China, but creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict with China is not entirely clear to me is something we should be doing. to hear people talk in Washington about the Peloponnesian Wars, the notion that Thucydides anticipated the U.S. China rivalry, and I mean, it's a little hard to take. I mean, most people can't spell Thucydides, and there they are quoting Thucydides, and I just don't think there's enough time this evening or any evening to describe the differences between contemporary China and ancient Sparta, and for that matter, I'm not sure the U.S. Contemporary U.S. and ancient Athens really has too much in common, maybe a few buildings with columns on it. But in short, I think we need to be careful about how we look at all this in terms of this competition. And I think we need to be especially careful, and I think the Obama administration has done well, to avoid this situation where obviously we can't be neutral between China and Japan, but at the same time, I don't think we want to be sort of lining up in a way that we look like we're going to war. So I think we have to be careful. But I must say, when I think back a few years ago, things have always been tough between Japan and China. And frankly speaking, I think Japan does need to do a little better job on the history. I was just talking to Professor Zhao today, and we were kind of lamenting the fact that in academia, people at times feel they can talk about a region of the world without mentioning the word history, let alone dates or place or things that happened. But in fact, I think you do have to respect the history. I spent a lot of time in Poland, and no one would have anticipated that Poland and Germany would have the good relationship they have. And you remember certain inflection points, and I can always remember way back in the early 70s when Willy Brandt went to Poland, and in a kind of scripted event where he's supposed to stand there stiffly while they put a wreath on the Ghetto Memorial in Warsaw, he threw away the script and went up to the monument and got down on his knees to beg forgiveness. I don't think we've seen that type of, we haven't seen a Japanese Willy Brandt, when you put it gently. So I think there does need to be a much greater effort to overcome the past. And I think what is especially worrisome, as I've mentioned now a couple of times, is to see the Chinese government always in a kind of mood to justify itself. I wish it would simply justify itself by putting itself to the vote of the people, but instead it justifies itself in terms of, we will protect the Chinese nation, we will protect against the century of shame, another century of shame, we will stand up for the honor of the country. I mean, that's all great, but why don't you just have an election on that? And at the same time, I do believe that Abe's approach to say that we won't apologize anymore is a little inaccurate, because I don't think he's ever apologized before. So I think there does need to be a conscious effort by some of these countries to sort of deal with the issue of nationalism, and first of all, never to make use of nationalism for political purposes. So, I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about, and I, for one, think that there's a great scope for the U.S. to continue to be engaged, and for that reason, I thank you and people like you who continue to really follow this issue, make this understandable to people in the U.S., and continue to make the point that we, I think, have a major role to play in preserving this Pacific heritage that we have. Thank you.
I'll just make a very brief response. Terrific comments. I certainly agree with everything you've said. If we can't bomb the islands and get rid of them, some people hope that if we can be patient, global warming will get rid of them for us. I know this is happening in some places in the South China Sea. I think that I wanted to comment on this, how the pivot is being sold, and I think there's been so much rhetoric and really not enough action. And to the extent that there has been action, many of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region complain that there's just too much emphasis on the military part of the pivot. these countries are crying out for greater commitment by the U.S. to support economic development in the region. And the only piece of the pivot that you can say is economic is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we all, are keeping our fingers crossed that this is actually going to be eventually put in place. But it is really the only card that we have that we're playing. And countries like the ASEAN countries are like a U.S.-ASEAN FTA, for example. But the worst possible case is that it's sold as something that is against China, when in fact it's really not putting in place capabilities that could really be that useful against China. I mean, frankly, even if we build up to 2,500 Marines in Darwin, it's really not going to help us to deal with a Chinese threat. But the Chinese worry about the political intentions, really, behind this pivot. And so one of the things that Jim Steinberg put forward very early in the Obama administration was the idea of having more strategic reassurance in the U.S.-China relationship. And it was a good idea. It was misinterpreted. It wasn't well coordinated throughout the government at the time. And there's probably nothing worse than an official coming out with his own idea and everybody else not having been brought on board. You've got to get people to, you know this better than I do, to sort of have ownership of your idea before you go out there with it publicly. And I heard it was like 7:30 at night he was rewriting his speech, and by that time it wasn't going to get cleared once again, and there were some surprises when he gave it the next day. But it was really unfortunate because that really sort of is the right idea in some ways. You want to have the deterrence and the part of it where you are dissuading the other country from doing something that would damage your interests, but you also want to reassure. And reassurance that the United States will accept China's rise as a power, as long as, of course, it doesn't seek to upend the international system, and we don't see China doing that. China's benefited a great deal from this international system, and they know that. So it has been too much rhetoric and not enough, I think, really important elements that on the ground are real meaningful to bring the region together. And I very much agree with your call for sort of multilateral structures. This is just not something that the Asia Pacific seems to be really willing to do. I mean, the East Asia Summit is yet again some new structure. Everybody has hope that it will be able to bring everyone together, but there's more they disagree with. The North Koreans are bringing us all together. That's right, that is definitely true. So, but terrific comments, thanks very much. What's really driving that nationalism, I don't know, but it certainly seems to get stronger and stronger. I understand it most comprehensively in the case of China, where it is taught in the schools, it's in the books, it's on TV every night, it's in the movie theater. I remember once visiting a family, they had this was probably more than a decade ago, so I don't know if this still goes on, but had like a 5 or 6 year old child who came home from kindergarten singing an anti-Japanese song, and I'm sure that child had no idea what those lyrics meant, but that nevertheless, that's what at least then was being taught in the schools. So this is a problem. It is an outgrowth of 1989 and the June 4th incident, where they really started teaching that anti-Japanese nationalism as a basis for the legitimacy of the Communist Party. So it will be difficult to deal with in every country, but I think each country has its own sort of separate roots and reasons for that nationalism. So happy to take comments and questions.
Okay, now the floor is open. Before we open this, I take advantage of my own position to start questions, if I may. I read the news from China, the National People's Congress, the Nianghui, and this conference are going on now, saying that just before the conference, Xi Jinping called a meeting, a senior level meeting, to talk about Japanese-China crisis. He set up a very new guidelines that we try to do everything to avoid military conflict with Japan. So in Liu Yuan, in fact, yesterday, today, his speech at the National People's Congress was so low, toned down so much So I don't know how do you respond if that's true. I heard only rumors. I cannot verify, but that seems from China's side to try to do everything to avoid a military conflict. Although you try to keep, they said radicals no, but military were ready. If there's anything happens, we can just fight. So that's what I heard. I don't know how you respond. Second question regarding the pivot. Jeff Bader gave an interview in Chinese magazine called Cherrington magazine. He made 3 points about the pivot. He said, first point is that we recognize China's rise is the most important thing in the 21st century. We have to recognize that, we work with that. Second, China's rise is uncertain. Even Chinese themselves don't know where China will go from here. So thirdly, in that case, there are a lot of countries in Asia Pacific are concerned with China's rise. U.S. should be prepared. So how do you respond to this interview in China? He talked to Chinese audience, which is in part in Chinese, in fact. So these two questions, how do you respond?
Well, I had not read about the meeting that you say that Xi Jinping called prior to the Liang Hui. I have read that last September, when this crisis first began, that he set up a small office, or he was put in charge of this new maritime office to deal with the Senkaku Diaoyu crisis. So he was clearly very involved from the beginning. Though, given what transpired at that time, I'm not sure I was very reassured by it. But I think that he has a strong interest in keeping the tensions tamped down on this issue, because I think he does recognize that it is potentially dangerous. But I think he has a very difficult tightrope to walk, because he does not want to be seen by the public as soft on the issue. He does want to be seen as supporting the military. This is a very important interest group for him. That doesn't mean supporting everything the military wants to do. And by the way, I'm not convinced that the military is an interest group or an actor in this case that is actually pushing very provocative measures. I think it could very well be some of these other actors that I referred to.
Luo Yuan is published this time. He lost his membership.
He lost his membership.
Yes.
Luo Yuan, yes, I heard, and he was criticized on Weibo by all of these people. But there will be another Luo Yuan. Now that Qian Lihua has retired, maybe he will take his place. We'll have to see. But I do hope that Xi Jinping is taking charge of this issue. When the leadership at the highest levels is paying attention, then I think that there is good coordination in China. It's when they're distracted by other things. And of course, we all recognize that Chinese leaders are first and foremost paying attention to the domestic situation. Read the Party Congress Work Report, the environment, pollution, of course, is first and foremost on their minds, not what's going on outside of Chinese borders. But if he is paying attention to this, then I think there is a good chance that the actors in the system can be well coordinated, that instructions can be sent down clearly and be implemented. As for your reference to Jeff Bader's remarks, I don't disagree. I think that we all recognize that China has many challenges that it faces internally. It is not a certainty that China is going to rise to be a great power. China hopes it is. I certainly hope prosperity for the Chinese people. But there's a lot of things that could go wrong. People are saying if there isn't further economic reform now, that the current model has basically run its course, and if China doesn't implement fundamental reforms, that they might be growing at somewhere like 5% in the next 5 years. And for China, that could be rather serious in terms of its political implications, as well as economic implications. So, I would agree that China's rise is uncertain. I'm not sure that we can completely say that we don't know what China's objectives are. I don't think China has any grand strategy to, take over the world. That's absurd. But China does want to recover what it believes it rightfully owns. And I think China would like to have a situation in the Asia-Pacific region where every country takes into account Chinese interests when it makes a decision. So that if The South Koreans, for example, are asked by the United States to expand the missions of the U.S. Korean alliance, and they are potentially useful against China and against Chinese interests. They hope that the South Koreans would take that into account. And indeed, I would say the South Koreans do in most circumstances. Not every country does. I mean, right now the Philippines is really not taking Chinese interests into account. But I think this is what China really wants. It's sort of like a throwback to the Chinese history of paying tribute, you know, to the emperor. I think just China wants to be sure that no country in the region is going to act in a way that's going to damage its interests, and that it will be able to cover its lost territories. Beyond that, I think that the page may be maybe not blank, but there is still much to be written on it in terms of what kind of power China will be as it becomes stronger.
Okay, the floor is open. Please identify yourself first and very brief. Okay.
David Chen, I'm a scholar. I appreciate Glaser's comments, but especially also Ambassador Dean Hill's comments, and I would like to throw to the feet of the panel and to the members of the audience here a potential solution that hits on the history, the nationalism, the multilateral structure issues. And the solution here that I would like to posit is that we transfer the administrative control of Senkakus to Taiwan. And this is based on Xi Jinping saying before he was elected General Secretary of the party that the Cairo Declaration should prevail. The State Council issuing a white paper saying that the Diaoyutai Islands are governed by the Cairo Declaration. And PLA generals and commentators publishing in official military newspapers that the Cairo Declaration should prevail. And the Cairo Declaration, if it's so important to the PRC, literally says the stolen territories should be transferred to the Republic of China, not the People's Republic. Obviously, because it predates the People's Republic. But in my view, in this case, in this sort of situation, we're able to use the sort of U.S. hub and spokes alliance structure more constructively than we have been, by including Taiwan as a constructive partner in solving this crisis.
Well, I said I wasn't going to get into history, so I won't, but I knew somebody would. You know, if China and Japan want to mutually agree that it could be transferred to Taiwan,
That's the answer.
good luck. It's not up to us to transfer them to anyone. We don't own them. And nor should we intervene in this issue on that way. I mean, we have it's important for U.S. policy to be consistent, and that is our consistent position, that we're neutral on sovereignty. But I would put out a scenario here that I hope doesn't come to pass. But if, and I don't want to say that I don't want to see the DPP come back to power, because that's not what I'm trying to say. And it was about to sound like that. There will be another election in Taiwan, and the opposition will eventually come back to power. And what we don't know is whether mainland Taiwan tensions will reemerge as a result once that opposition does come back to power. And you know, things were pretty bad in the mid-2000s. The U.S. was very concerned about the potential for a military conflict. And now that China's getting more confident, we don't know whether they would just dismiss shenanigans by a new government in Taiwan. But in that kind of situation, I'm not sure that I would want to see those islands controlled by Taiwan. They could end up being the casus belli. They could end up causing war between the two sides. So again, you're looking for a history solution, and that's exactly why I avoided it, because I think from an American point of view, it's not up to us to decide.
You know, Professor Zhao and I saw Maya Zhong in December, and his approach was to offer Taiwan services to mediate between China and Japan, because Taiwan has a reasonable relationship with Japan. My answer was, go for it, you know. But you know, and I'll make one other comment. You know, I was involved with the Dayton Peace Accords, and after the Dayton Peace Accords, everyone looked at this thing and said, why did you do this? The answer was everyone agreed with it. And why didn't you do that? The answer is people didn't agree with it. You know, we got to the point, if they wanted to call it the Grand Duchy of Bosnia, that would have been fine if everyone agreed to it. So it's a question really of what is possible.
Okay, Tom.
Tom Drawn from the Air Force Academy, and I can't understand why you think airplanes are dangerous for one. But you know, I guess I
P-3 and the F-7, so they had minor collisions.
I guess it goes kind of fast. You know, in the scenes between peace and war, I've read that the Central Military Commission has more of a role because of the contingency planning, and you know, at the point at which you know the Politburo Standing Committee Secretariat sort of hand off the issue to the Central Military Commission, it may be the point where it really becomes militarized. And is there any insight as to who is on the Central Military Commission now and whether they are like, you know, Liu Huaqing or more moderate? Or do you not agree with that? That's, you know, I know it's kind of a black box to me, but.
The most important person on that Central Military Commission is Xi Jinping. And the military, of course, has nobody in the Politburo Standing Committee, and one of Xi Jinping's job is to talk to the military, discuss the issue with them, and then take their view and represent the military, of course, in the context of what he wants to do and the policy that he wants to pursue in the Politburo Standing Committee. The military usually stays in its own lane. It will make recommendations, proposals on issues that have to do with purely military things. When it comes to policies outside of pure military things, the military actually, there's a lot of media reporting out there about how the PLA is becoming more assertive in Chinese foreign policy. You know, in my view, the party really does control the gun.
Even in the matters of sovereignty, because I'm thinking of the Taiwan Strait crisis.
On the kinds of it, if the Taiwan Strait crisis, if you go back to 95, 96, you know, the civilian leadership asked the military for a set of options. What can you do? And the military came up with the options, and I think the civilians said that's all you could do at the time. But and then they chose, and the military went ahead and did that. There are things that are really quite different from our system. You know, if the military wants to go conduct an exercise, you know, our commands have to go back to people in Washington, and State, and the White House, and they have to get permission on the scope and the location and the timing, and sometimes they're told, no, you can't go sail to George Washington in the Yellow Sea. But in China, the military actually can conduct exercises pretty much whenever and wherever it wants. And the people in the foreign ministry go, what the hell is that, you know, flotilla doing out there? That sort of conflicts with what we want to do. So there are those kinds of problems. Okay, but we do have a system. It just doesn't always work. Is that fair enough?
Excellent way to put it.
Okay. The Chinese don't even have that system in place. So, you know, I would just say, you know, I would put, but I think Xi Jinping is the most important person, and he has, I believe, the potential to have greater authority over the military than Hu Jintao had.
Okay, so the time's about down in 2 more minutes will be 6:30. That's we see the hands. So we raise all questions, then we can see if we can. Okay, see. Okay, each have 3 seconds to answer to ask questions.
So my name is Patricia Nelson. I'm with the European Institute of Japanese Studies. So I wanted to go back to the beginning in which you talked about with how the Japanese were trying to do anything independent. It just was maybe not handled so well by Japan. And then I wanted to link that to what you said about, or what was said about how domestic concerns seem to be key, often in determining things. And from looking at Japan, as a specialist in your area, my impression is that domestic issues often.
So you have go over more than 3 seconds.
Okay. So if domestic concerns are important, and we have a very strong leader in Abe who wants to get rid of Article 9 of the Constitution, I was just wondering if you had some thoughts about the U.S. Japan Security Treaty and its future.
Okay, you have a question here? No. Okay, there. Just 2 seconds.
Sure. My name is Colin Lawrence. I'm a second-year student here, and I was just wondering, who's taking the photos?
Okay, that easy question. Leave that. Any more question here? One more.
Yeah, mine is just, what does the international community recognize as the boundaries or borders that from those competing boundaries between Japan and
Okay, so you are in the 2-second limit, so 1 second.
Slightly off topic, I'm encouraged by the American basketball team and Dennis Rodman being in North Korea. I'd just be interested in your reaction.
Oh, I'm going to let Chris answer.
Okay.
Touch that one with a 10-foot.
Okay, you have a half second.
Half second, sorry. Last month we had Ambassador Huntsman come out to the Air Force Academy, and he made a comment that I thought was very interesting about the potential for accident in the region because of all the new leadership transition, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, all are transitioning in new leadership. So I wanted to see what you thought about that and the lineage of all those people who are coming into leadership. You know, their grandfathers were heavily involved in World War II, and is there, I know you don't want to go into history, but is there that history of the third generation playing out now?
Okay, so you have 1 second to answer all the questions.
Yeah, I have no idea who took the photos. They're on the internet. I didn't take them, I can tell you that. So I'm not a Japan specialist. I think that Abe probably, from my understanding, wants to reinterpret the Constitution. I think that's quite different, and allowing for collective defense. And that's something that I think many people in the United States would like to see. After all, if we have a ship out in Japanese waters and it's not threatening Japan, but it's threatening us, Japan can't come to our aid. We're obligated to defend Japan. It's a bit of a lack of reciprocity there. There are many other things that Abe wants to do that are potentially troublesome. The apology for the war that Chris mentioned, of course, the comfort women. I mean, there's so. Some of these things could be of concern. I think actually this is one of the reasons why the United States has been especially cautious about what it said publicly about the Senkaku Diaoyu issue, because it really doesn't want to embolden Abe. We'll see after the elections in July, if he really wins the upper house elections, what he really wants to do. But I think, for the United States, goes without saying, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is just critically important for our presence in Asia, full stop. Without Japan, we can't have the kind of military presence in Asia that we have, and it would certainly curtail, I think, our influence. International borders, I mean, the UN Convention, the Law of the Sea allows for a 200-mile, exclusive economic zones, but you can see in this map they conflict, and so you can take it to an international court, but you have to start with land features. First, you define who owns the land features, and then which land features generate either a 12-mile territorial waters or 200-mile EEZ. And so if you don't go to the international courts, then you just have what each country claims. China and Japan had agreed to do joint development at the Twinxiao field. And then that got derailed, and there is potential for cooperation, but right now there are no real international borders. I'm going to leave Dennis Rodman, and I'm sure you would have some interesting comments on the new leaders issue as well. I don't think myself, and I'm not going to comment on South Korea and Manam Park, but I don't think Xi Jinping brings with him, I mean, he's a princeling, there's a lot of that he brings in terms of his connections, but maybe his support from within the military will flow from his father to some extent. But in terms of looking at what he will do and how he will behave as a leader, I don't know. I'm not so sure that would come from whatever is his father being a revolutionary leader. But it's very important that all of these countries are having new leaders sort of come in at the same time. And that creates both opportunities as well as challenges, as they all want to be seen strong domestically, and therefore less willing to compromise. But I think they all recognize they're going to be there for a while and they want to get along. But I'll let Ambassador help.
We're all second generation.
Oh yeah, well, I don't really think anything good can come out of visit by Dennis Rodman.
Ping pong diplomacy.
Yeah, Dennis Rodman doesn't play ping pong. Seriously, I think the whole thing was it was a lot of buffoonery. I think it really was not helpful. I don't think Dennis Rodman speaks for anybody. I don't think he knew anything about this issue. And the notion that somehow if President Obama calls Kim Jong-un, everything will be okay, I think is simply beyond naive. I think what we have now is a regime that is basically trying to do a couple of things, one of which is to build up the support for its leader, and they're trying to invent a crisis in order to show that this leader is sort of up to the challenge. And I think it's pretty clear, unless they miscalculate. And by the way, that's always the question on this. The question on Senkaku, it's a question on a lot of things. If there's a miscalculation in the context of the motion, but I think basically what you see is just a bit of an uptick on their bluster, and I think the North Koreans are hoping that this will frighten some countries into somehow saying, we need to do more for North Korea to bring them back to the table, etc. I think there's some value to all this. First of all, Kim Jong-un is not a reformer. He never was. I think that was a question of wishful thinking. Secondly, I think it is pretty clear that North Korea has embarked on a campaign to marry up a nuclear device and a missile. That's consistent with all their testing programs. And I think now is the time for China. When you look at the post-World War II security environment, China had one thing to do, and that was to sit on North Korea. And China has failed in its one security requirement in terms of the region, in terms of the international system. We did a lot. We brought Japan along. We brought Japan along in a way that I think has been very beneficial to the world. We brought South Korea along. We managed issues in the cross-straits. China had one thing to do, and so far they've failed. And so I think what is encouraging about China is, I think, and whether, I agree with Bonnie, we don't really have much to go on at this point. But I think we might have a Chinese leadership that is looking at the range of issues they face. Maybe, just maybe, they're getting a little tired of this little country that has to manufacture crises in order to survive. North Korea is going to have to eat more than crises to survive. And so I think now is the time to really try to not add to the rhetoric and not add to the buffoonery of people like Dennis Rodman, but rather add to the quality and the depth of the dialogue with China and see what we can do to try to deal with this problem. We need to conquer the view in China that somehow North Korea's demise would be a victory for America and a defeat for China. That kind of old think needs to be dealt with and defeated. I think China needs to kind of understand that there can be a win-win to giving the Korean people the right that they historically have, which is to determine the future of the Korean peninsula.
Okay, with that note, please join me to thank Bonnie Glaser and also our Dean, Ambassador here. Thank you. I'm so lucky now we have a resident ambassador here who always make comments on those issues, especially on China and Asia. And also thank you all for coming. This is Friday evening. We have a snowstorm coming, so thank you and have a good weekend.
Is there another one scheduled?
Yeah, we have this quarter is over, so we'll make an announcement for next quarter. Okay, thank you.